There was a moment in my career as a forensic doctor when an insignificant detail completely changed the course of an investigation. A trail that no one had noticed became the key to revealing a truth that seemed buried forever. This is a story of a case that started as just another routine, but ended up teaching me that in the tragedy of a life, every fragment is vital, and that sometimes the smallest thing has the power to tell the biggest story. My name is Pablo Serrano. I am 39 years old, and I work as a forensic doctor here in Montevideo, Uruguay. Over the years, I have seen many scenes, many deaths, but few have affected me as much as this one. Before I begin, let me know in the comments where you are watching this video from, so I can know how far it has reached. It all started with a call on an ordinary day, a lifeless body in an apartment downtown. Nothing unusual, just another case of the department. But something about the way the discovery was reported made me pay special attention. When I arrived at the scene, the place was untouched with no signs of apparent violence. The victim, a middle-aged man, had apparently died during the night. At first glance, it seemed like a natural case, but there was a detail that caught my attention. A thin line of disturbed dust on the floor, something the police team had not noticed. It was barely a subtle trace, like a footprint half erased. But from my experience, these kinds of details can speak louder than any testimony. From that moment, I knew that small clue could be the difference between a closed case and a hidden truth. As I began the autopsy, I couldn't stop thinking about that trace. What did it mean? Was it accidental or intentional? Was the body perhaps saying something beyond the apparent natural cause of death? At that moment, I remembered a lesson I always tell myself. Never trust what seems trivial. Death is silent, but it always leaves clues, and sometimes only trained eyes can see them. What followed that morning was a series of discoveries that changed everything I thought I knew about the case. The insignificant trace set in motion an investigation that unearthed secrets buried beneath the surface of an apparently ordinary death. This case taught me to look patiently, to listen respectfully, and to understand that everybody holds a story that deserves to be told to the end. And today I want to share that story with you, so you understand why we must never ignore what doesn't seem important at first glance. That morning when I received the body seemed like just another in the heavy routine, but something in the silence of the morgue already gave me a strange feeling. It was an apparently simple case. A man of about 50 years old, deceased under natural circumstances, according to the initial reports. But there were doubts. I confess that at first my mind was elsewhere. I had several reports to present, autopsies to review, but as I approached the body, I inevitably noticed a subtle, almost imperceptible detail that no one else had seen, and that ended up being the key to everything. Standing by the autopsy table, I observed the body covered with a white sheet, that characteristic silence surrounding me as I slowly removed the cloth. The skin showed typical paleness, but what immediately caught my attention were the small, irregular spots on one of the wrists. At first glance, they could have been just marks caused by rigor mortis or a simple position adopted when falling. But something didn't fit. My gaze stopped on a faint trace of reddish dust, almost like a fine powder, which contrasted with the cold, oily skin. It wasn't fresh blood, nor was it common dirt. It was different. There was something strange about that texture that forced me to look closer. It was in that tiny detail that the first crack appeared in the apparent tranquility of the case. One particle. Then another along the arm, barely perceptible, forming a kind of fleeting trail that faded into the deceased's clothing. I immediately asked for the cameras to be brought in to document every angle, and as I did so, I felt how the scene began to transform into something beyond a simple report. The story the body held was demanding to be listened to carefully. With patience and method, I unraveled that invisible trail for others. Those small particles had a mineral texture, and upon analyzing preliminary data of the environment where the body was found, I confirmed that the dust did not belong to the place. It was a specific type of oxide, a material found in certain mechanical workshops, not in the quiet residential area where the man lived. Why and how that dust had reached him was now the question driving me to dig deeper, guided by that clue that no one had considered important. As I progressed through the autopsy, every tissue revealed contradictions to the initial version of natural death. There were minimal but unequivocal signs of silent struggle. Slight bruises beyond what could be attributed to aging, small marks that seemed more recent. But what truly stunned me was finding a tiny, almost imperceptible object lodged under the right thumbnail. It was a rough metallic fragment, barely distinguishable to the naked eye, but under the microscope it shone like crucial evidence. That detail triggered a mix of adrenaline and deep respect within me for the body, which was at once witness and victim. Memories of previous cases, stories that seemed simple but where the truth was hidden behind small signs, flooded me once more. I had to act with utmost caution, but I could not stop. If that man had experienced something darker than everyone believed, it was my duty to bring it to light. From that moment on, I immersed myself in an investigation that went beyond the lab. I talked to police officers, reviewed the last hours recorded by cameras near the house, and encountered a scene of contradictions. The family offered versions that didn't match. Some neighbors mentioned unexpected visits, and a witness's account of dark trucks speeding away now took on a new dimension. The fragmented narrative began to fit with my findings, shaping a mystery that seemed to come alive with every small fact accumulated. The most baffling thought was that if I hadn't stopped at those reddish particles and that fragment on the nail, everything would have been filed away as a sad and irrelevant, unexpected death. But forensic investigation's patience does not accept shortcuts, and I found myself at the intersection of science and the deepest human understanding, the one that knows every body carries a story beyond the visible. Pressure mounted as the possibilities took shape in my mind. Had it been a covered-up crime, or a misfortune disguised as an accident? And in that whirlwind, the initial scene regained prominence. That dust, so subtle, dragged from a workshop of body, seemed a bridge connecting events, an invisible path slowly leading me toward the truth of what had happened. Night fell, and with it, the solitude of the morgue seemed to deepen. I stayed longer than usual, reviewing every image, every analysis, feeling that something big was approaching, that this small trace had secrets ready to come to light, that external calm could not fool me. Inside, the storm of questions and deductions kept growing, latent, intense. That metallic fragment ended up sparking the decisive ignition. It demanded to be examined with advanced technology. When I received the laboratory report, the object turned out to be part of a small device from a type of electronic lock that had been reported stolen the previous week from a nearby warehouse. That unexpected connection pushed me to look for other evidence and link apparently scattered networks of information, beginning to intertwine into an increasingly complex web. It was not just a death from natural causes or a trivial accident. It was a silent message, a truth hidden in small details, a trace that had remained invisible to everyone until someone, with patience and respect, decided to look beyond the obvious. Because among so many bodies that passed through my hands, each is a closed book that deserves to be opened carefully to tell what silence cannot speak. Knowing that this forgotten trace changed everything for me left me with a lesson I keep as an invisible treasure. No matter how insignificant a detail seems, it may hold the key to revealing the entire story. In forensic medicine, commitment, calm, and respect are tools as vital as the scalpel or the magnifying glass, because behind every case is a human being, and every story deserves to be told with all its truth. That night, as I turned off the morgue lights, I stayed with one last image in my mind. The almost invisible mark that no one had seen and yet changed the fate of that case and those seeking justice and answers. A small particle, a forgotten fragment, an invisible trail that finally could speak. The early morning stretched on as I continued to mentally review every detail, every image, every laboratory analysis. The metallic piece on the fingernail was like a code waiting to be deciphered, a tiny fragment that seemed to whisper secrets. The report of the stolen device had reactivated the police investigation, which allowed me access to privileged information about the ongoing inquiries. The warehouse from which that electronic lock had been taken was located just a few blocks from the deceased's home, but curiously, there was no direct evidence that the man had visited that place. I began to consider another possibility. What if the man, more than just a simple victim, had been inadvertently involved in that theft? Or worse, what if he was an uncomfortable witness to something he shouldn't have seen? The idea started to take shape when I examined the scene at the house more closely. There were no obvious signs of robbery or significant violence, not even forced entry through doors or windows, but that small trace of dust and the metal fragment indicated to me that something else was going on. All the pieces seemed to fit into a puzzle, carefully constructed to avoid being solved. And the deeper I dug, the more I realized that the truth was not in the visible evidence, but in those minute details that most overlook. So, I decided to request that the technicians revisit the smallest bruise at the base of the neck, which to the naked eye looked like an insignificant blemish on the man's skin. I asked for an exhaustive toxicological analysis, as I suspected there were substances in the body that might not have been detected in the initial tests. While waiting for those results, a police officer approached me to talk. He told me that during previous interviews, a neighbor recalled seeing the deceased arguing heatedly the night before with a group of unknown people traveling in that dark van, the same one the casual witness had mentioned, and that they left shortly afterward in the opposite direction from the warehouse. That information added another layer to the story, a layer that now portrayed my subject not as a passive victim, but as someone involved in tensions no one had imagined. One night, upon returning to the morgue after break, I felt the need to review the dust trace on the wrist again. The dim light of the lab cast long shadows over the body's surface. Looking at it under the microscope, I noticed that the dust was not just common rust, but contained a chemical component compatible with certain industrial lubricants used in the maintenance of heavy machinery. Who could have come into contact with that? And what was that dust doing mixed with skin residues? I found myself wondering if this connection to the dust was a clue to a place, an activity, or a person. I went back to review the security camera footage they had given me, try to find something that would confirm or refute my suspicions. The sequence showed the dark van passing near the man's residence several times, but on that particular night, one detail went unnoticed by everyone except me. In one of the shots, although blurry, you could see a hooded figure coming down carrying a small box, probably metallic, which left a trail of reddish dust as it was placed on the ground. It was not a clear image, but it was enough to suspect that there was an intentional action there and that the man had been involved, willingly or unwillingly, in something dangerous. I then decided to seek out people connected to the deceased. In the following weeks, I interviewed relatives, friends, and acquaintances, trying to reconstruct not only his movements, but his relationships. What I discovered was a complex web. The man had been working off the books in a nearby workshop, the kind of place where that reddish dust and industrial oil were commonplace. No one mentioned it in initial statements. It was as if that information had been deliberately hidden or perhaps forgotten by the family, maybe to protect him or because they didn't understand the significance of that fact. That revelation completely changed the perspective. He was not an ordinary citizen who had simply died of natural causes, but someone exposed to risky situations, with ties that explained the presence of dust on his wrists, the piece of the lock under his nail, and the palpable tension in that last argument reported by the neighbor. The idea that it tried to report or prevent something illicit slowly gained strength, along with the certainty that his death was by no means a simple medical matter. Amid this storm, an unexpected toxicology report arrived at the lab. The test revealed the presence of a rare compound, a type of sedative not common in the regular market, but used in industrial procedures or by specialized personnel. Another blow to the official version of natural death. The man had been subjected to poisoning, a form of neutralization that likely preceded or caused his death. This confirmation plunged me into a whirlpool of mixed emotions. I had managed to break through the silence, but I also understood that a shadow of danger still lurked over this case. It was no surprise that, after these revelations, the police circles began to move more cautiously. I knew something larger was at play, a criminal network using high-precision technologies, involving warehouse thefts, people who prefer to stay in the shadows and eliminate any uncomfortable witnesses. All of this made sense when observing the tiny, invisible trace that only someone trained would know how to look for. Days passed during which the investigation took on an even more clandestine tone. I received anonymous calls and subtle warnings intended to bias my investigation. I also felt pressure from some entities to speed up the reports or conclude the autopsy quickly. But I did not give in. My commitment to the truth and to the body before me required every second of my attention and scientific rigor. Every detail mattered because amid the shadows of oblivion, justice was born from these almost mutual particles. While reviewing the evidence, I was forced to confront the family with the proof. Dust compatible with mechanical workshop, traces of a toxic compound, the stolen lock. At first, They denied everything, but when I showed them images and reports, a crack opened in their silence. The truth came to light gradually, relentlessly, and painfully. The man, they confessed, had tried to alert the authorities about irregularities in his clandestine workplace, becoming a problematic witness for unknown organizations. With this information, the police investigation intensified, surrounding the workshop and its connections to organized crime networks. And I, beyond the scientific analysis, felt the human responsibility. It was not only about deciphering a body, but honoring a life that perhaps through its death had saved many others, whose story remained preserved in that small trace no one wanted to see at first. I remember that in the midst of all this, one night, while reviewing once again the photos of the dust trace, I stopped at a detail that had previously escaped my notice. The distribution of the dust seemed to indicate that the man had resisted, that there had been a brief but decisive struggle near the entrance to his house. It was not an accidental event nor a strange twist of fate, but an intentional confrontation, an attempt to intimidate or silence, that explained the minor injuries and the specific location of the particles. Every particle had a place and a reason. At that moment, I understood that the dust was not only physical evidence, but symbolic, a mark of conflict, a sign of resistance and protest. The entire story of the body, from that dust to the metal fragment, spoke of a truth that resisted being buried in oblivion, and although the man was no longer there to tell it, his body did so through those small silent witnesses. I will never forget the mix of feelings I had when closing the final case file. The satisfaction of having decrypted a hidden message combined with the sadness of a life cut short and the uncertainty about the rough paths that truth would bring. I knew justice might be slow or incomplete, but at least the story had been told, and it had been done through science and patience. That lesson is etched in my memory and my work. Never underestimate the smallest details. In forensic work, truth lurks in patience, in a watchful eye, in that silent pause to observe what others ignore. Because every body is a living archive, an irreplaceable and sacred testimony. As I left Moore that last night, the cool air hit my face and I thought of that man, an ordinary person who, without knowing it, had left small, almost invisible but powerful clues. A trace that no one else noticed, and yet changed everything. I understood then that the key to our profession lies in listening carefully, in respecting the story each body holds, even when it appears only as a speck of dust or a fragment beneath a nail. In that silence resides a voice of truth. Days passed during which the investigation progressed at a frustratingly slow pace, as if wandering through dense and silent shadows. Every new piece of information we obtained seemed to open doors, but at the same time forced us to walk through more intricate corridors full of twists and turns. The clandestine workshop the family mentioned was far from a simple establishment where engines were worked on. Preliminary police reports described a place hosting illegal activities related to the manipulation and theft of high-tech components, something that explained the mysterious dust and industrial lubricants we found. Beyond the criminal mechanism, there was a power game that seemed to involve several players and add layers of danger to every move. At first glance, the attitude of the family and acquaintances of the deceased revealed a mixture of fear and resignation. It was evident that the shadow of those operating in that environment was not limited to the workshop or stolen objects. Their influence extended beyond, affecting the community and sowing silence and reluctance. It was then that, amid this oppressive atmosphere, I received an unexpected call, almost a whisper on the other end of the line. The voice was deep, measured, but with a certain urgency. Don't get involved any further. It's bigger than you imagine. Let others handle it. Those words did not come from a stranger, but from someone who seemed to know much, too much, about what was happening. Despite the warning, I could not allow the case to be forgotten or left in the hands of those seeking only to cover up the evidence. I felt driven to dig deeper, not to let the pieces scatter into a web of complicity. It was during those long nights of insomnia and scattered notes that I began to review the protocols, results, and photographs again, trying to find any overlooked element. Deep down, I was looking for conclusive proof, something that could discredit biased versions and open a clear path to justice. During one of those meticulous reviews, something in the workshop's production records caught my attention. There was a list of inputs and outputs of materials on crucial days, but an irregular pattern stood out. Small metal pieces cataloged as prototypes disappeared without apparent control, precisely on dates close to the death. I thought, if any of these prototypes were related to the stolen lock, then the idea of a common theft was ruled out, and that man was deeper in the complex machinery of crime than we imagined. It was not easy to fit those pieces together. But following that lead, I asked the police cybercrime team to track any sale or electronic transfer involving parts similar to those missing. The results took time, but when they arrived, they showed suspicious movements towards shell companies and encrypted emails with uncommon terminology, an invisible web to the naked eye, but with well-marked digital footprints for those who knew where to look. Amid this network of small truths, the human effort took center stage. I personally decided to meet with some workshop employees who had stayed out of suspicion, hoping trust would arise with direct conversation and open listening. It was there that I better understood the hostile environment that prevailed, veiled testimonies, lowered gazes, but also glimmers of courage. A woman, a low-profile employee, told me disturbing acts, moments when the deceased tried to lure about irregularities, had tense encounters, and was subject to veiled threats, details the family kept, perhaps out of fear or pain. These confessions led me to reconsider every minimal sign of violence on the body, every trace of dust or stain, as testimony of a confrontation prior to death, not mere accidents. The resistance seen through those signs was also a story of courage in the face of fear, of a truth defended despite the consequences. It was at that moment that I felt not only that I was working for justice, but carrying an almost sacred responsibility, to give voice to a man who, with imposed silence, kept an urgent complaint alive. But the escalating tension did not end there. As the clues partially cleared, new obstacles began to appear. Documents disappeared. Interviews were abruptly canceled, and pressure began to manifest more directly. On one occasion, while reviewing reports in the office, I noticed someone had tried to access my computer without permission. I reported the incident, but understood it was only a small battle in a silent war. My involvement in the case disturbed people with resources to hide truths, and that certainty kept me alert. Meanwhile, the toxicology report came under renewed scrutiny. The substance found in the body was not only a rare sedative, but its concentration and nature indicated deliberate use, designed to incapacitate, without leaving evident signs of direct violence. This meant the death was not accidental nor due to negligence, but a planned and precise act. The implications were clear. The deceased was a victim of an organized neutralization, part of a control mechanism that refused to allow his complaints or actions. From that confirmation, the new evidence allowed the police to slow down illicit activities around the workshop. The focus turned to people with records linked to technological crimes and industrial property offenses, and to shell companies functioning as financial covers. But beyond the police hunt, I felt we were touching a sensitive nerve in society, in hidden power structures lurking behind everyday life. Then, almost by chance, one last element emerged like a light in the darkness. Reviewing security camera footage, I saw another figure I had not noticed before, an elderly man with a book on his arm, who approached the workshop at several times, always discreetly. He was not listed among employees nor in any statements, but when comparing faces with databases, I discovered he was a former electronic industry technician, with a past linked to investigations of corruption and technological sabotage. His connection to the workshop and the deceased was unclear, but contacting him was enough for, after a tense conversation, him to reveal that the dead man had been a key informant. That information escalated the case to a level few imagined. It was not just a theft or a common crime, but part of a network seeking to dismantle a local technological corruption system. This revelation completely changed the course of the police investigation. Now, all those involved took more visible positions, some trying to clear their names, others disappearing from the scene. The workshop was shut down, and legal processes began to determine responsibilities. However, in my scientific role, I understood that even if justice began to move, the true story of the deceased man should not be lost in technicalities or bureaucratic processes. That is why I continued supervising analyses, ensuring every finding was meticulously recorded so no detail would be questioned later. I wondered then what had led that ordinary man to become so deeply involved in such a dangerous scheme. I thought about his last days, about the moment when he probably felt that fighting was inevitable, that silence was not an option. And so, I remember that firm look I saw in the photographs, the same I sense in the testimonies, the look that beats in the bodies of those who, even in adversity, resist so that their truth does not die with them. This case became for me more than an investigation. It was a lesson about the value of the invisible, of the subtle, in learning that the body does not lie, and that in the smallest traces larger stories can be revealed than one might imagine. There lay the key, in not being carried away by the surface, in dissecting every fragment with infinite patience, in considering the human story behind every sign. And although justice now advances desperately and several criminal heads have been identified, I know the fight for truth is endless, because there is always something hidden, a shadow waiting to be illuminated by science and ethics, a name silenced too soon that needs to be remembered. That man left me a profound lesson, that truth has many faces, but always speaks silently, in traces only an attentive gaze can capture. When I close the final file of this case, I do not feel a completed achievement, but a renewed commitment. The dust I collected, the fragment of the nail, the small bruise no one noticed, all of them are part of the secret language that tells us no one dies in vain, that stories remain and that bodies speak when words fail. Every time I hear that silent voice, I remember why I chose this profession. To be the guardian of those hidden truths, the mediator between life and death, the interpreter of invisible traces. And although the night can still bring shadows and dangers, I know the path I chose is the right one. Because, in the end, what truly matters is not only to unravel the facts, but to honor those who trust us to tell what they cannot express. That is the reason I keep going with the same patience and respect, always searching, always listening, always learning that in forensic science, as in life, the smallest detail can change everything. Contact with that older man not only provided information, but also introduced a new dimension to the case, one that would have gone unnoticed if I had insisted on following every lead, no matter how insignificant it seemed. What began as an investigation into an illegal workshop and a suspicious death had transformed into a search for a complex network involving people of different profiles and levels of power, where threats did not come only from common crime, but from structures almost invisible to society. That network, subtle yet powerful, orchestrated illegal activities that infiltrated technology, finance, and local politics. As the police tightened the noose and justice initiated procedures against the visible suspects, the feeling that something bigger was happening intensified. In my forensic role, I found that not only the body spoke, but also every circumstance, absence, and bad decision had something to say. Thus, I decided to devote more time to reviewing the circumstances prior to the death. There, in seemingly routine documents, I found another sign that few had detected. A pattern of dropped phone calls and unknown numbers registered on the deceased's phone just days before his death. They were not casual conversations or random contacts. These were coded messages that only someone with deep knowledge could understand, and those numbers were connected to groups that, according to previous investigations, were linked to industrial espionage and manipulation of technological information. This clue reinforced the idea that the man was not involved by chance, or because he had found his life in just any workshop, but occupied a crucial place in a much larger game. Thinking about this produced in me a mix of admiration and tragedy. Admiration for his decision to confront something so dangerous, and tragedy because I understood that such bravery had come at a high cost. Meanwhile, the atmosphere in the workshop and the community remained tense. People avoided speaking, sometimes casting evasive glances or murmuring brief comments, almost as if they feared that merely uttering words could disturb the fragile security they barely maintained. More than once, the reports collected revealed that some employees had changed residences or requested sick leave without convincing explanations. These facts were clear signs that the network of intimidation and surveillance was effective, and that the forces behind the case could exert pressure not only through direct violence, but also through fear and psychological manipulation. Amid that atmosphere, I even noticed how the subtle threats began to materialize in everyday gestures, anonymous messages left in the mailbox, watchful looks when entering and leaving the morgue, calls at odd hours with no word spoken on the other end. Awareness grew that I was entering a territory where the truth could come at a price, and that my duty must not yield to those signals. My commitment to science and to the memory of the deceased pushed me to persist with greater determination. With that mindset, I decided to undertake one last exhaustive review of the body and personal belongings found, hoping that something, however small, would untangle the knot that still persisted. It was then that I noticed something that in the initial reports had seemed trivial: a very faint mark on the man's wrist, practically invisible to the naked eye, but under the right light revealed a small incision, possibly caused by a needle. The idea that this wound could have been the route for administering the sedative led me to reanalyze the toxicity patterns and timing to see if that calculation matched the scene. And indeed, the temporal correlation confirmed what was suspected. The sedative was neither accidental nor the result of voluntary consumption, but rather a dangerous and deliberate act. In the context of a covert murder, through meticulous physical neutralization, that small incision turned out to be the final piece of the forensic puzzle that validated the thesis of a planned and precisely executed death. More than a scientific fact, for me it was an emotional blow, understanding that someone in the dark had manipulated not only the life but also the death of this person to silence him. From there, the case took on a different rhythm. It was not just a police investigation or a set of medical procedures. It was also an ethical act, a vindication of memory, and a fight against the impunity that hidden powers sought to keep intact. Every confirmed detail was a small act of resistance. The judicial machinery began to move, although aware that such a deployment would never be enough to completely eradicate the roots of the problem. But at least it was a first step. I then received news that the woman who had entrusted me with the deceased's veiled threats had decided to collaborate officially, despite the obvious risk. Her testimony not only confirmed the suspicions being handled, but also opened new fronts of investigation toward people who until then remained in the shadows, taking advantage of the so-called impunity that corruption offers. That woman's courage gradually became a light that seemed to start breaking part of the dark veil covering the entire network. However, as the case gained visibility, the pressures also increased. On one occasion, a close friend warned me that he had been followed for weeks by unidentified people and that my family was receiving suspicious calls. I understood that not only the investigation, but also those of us supporting the search for truth were target of active and organized resistance. This realization only deepened my conviction that moving forward was essential and that we could not allow fear to dictate our actions. The following months were a mix of judicial advances and constant obstacles. While the police managed to dismantle small groups within the network and several key figures were charged, other actors remained invisible, guarding themselves in anonymity under the cover of powerful interests. That dynamic showed that corruption and criminality were embedded in layers difficult to eradicate, where each partial victory was also a reminder of the endless struggle. Personally, I continued to observe every new forensic report, every medical record, until I understood that the death, besides being a reflection of a violent act, was a symbol of a system that seeks silence through coercion. The deceased body thus became a living testimony, even in eternal silence, of resistance and the search for justice. I felt that my mission as a forensic scientist transcended the laboratory. It was, in a sense, a link between science and society, between evidence and collective memory. One day, while reviewing digital files, I found a hidden folder on one of the devices seized in a workshop. Upon opening it, the contents revealed documents, photos, and communications detailing illegal operations linked to shell companies, money laundering, and a list of names involved in the corrupt network. It was a time bomb explaining why certain actors had stubbornly tried to halt the investigation. That evidence not only reinforced the magnitude of the problem, but forced a reconsideration of how to approach the case from a higher level. I shared that discovery with a small group of trusted investigators, understanding that discretion was vital to avoid leaks and possible accidents that could silence witnesses or saboteurs. The environment grew even tenser, with clandestine meetings and discreet operations. I felt that, in the end, we were playing a game where the rules were unclear and where the cost of losing could be high. However, that evidence gave us a powerful weapon to confront the structures that until then seemed unreachable. It was then that, in the darkest night of my own uncertainty, I remembered that phrase I had heard and felt so many times in the lab, that bodies do not lie, that the truth is in the details. That lesson lit up my path again. I understood that to win this battle, it was not enough to deal big legal or media blows, but with patient work, meticulous study, and the ability to listen to what silence seemed to whisper, an almost imperceptible murmur hidden in minimal remains. That conviction became the strength that sustained me during the hardest moments. And now, looking back, I know that this case, with all its visible and invisible wounds, marked a before and after in my career. Not only because it showed me the depth of the evil that can hide behind an apparently simple scene, but because it taught me the enormous responsibility we have as interpreters of that truth, who make science not only a technical tool, but a platform for justice and memory. For those working in forensic medicine, this story is a reminder that no detail is too small to ignore, and that often the key is not in the great dramatic discoveries, but in those tiny signs that, put together, tell the true story. Something that only patience and tireless observation can reveal, and that can make the difference between oblivion and justice. I can say, without exaggeration, that every time I review those fragments, those stains and the data related to that man, I feel a mix of respect, sadness, and renewed purpose. Respect for the life that was lost, sadness at the violence that cut it short, and purpose because I know that by telling his story through the traces, I take part in an act that goes beyond science. I take part in the most human act of all, that of dignifying the past and opening a path toward truth. Even now, when the case seems closed to the public, it remains open to me, because the wounds, though invisible, persist and memory is not erased by archive files or fleeting press headlines. The story of that man, that workshop, and the dark network they wanted to keep intact lives on in every analysis, every piece of evidence, and the firm commitment of those of us who keep believing in the precise word of a body that opposes injustice. And although sometimes it seems that silence is stronger than the voice, I learn to listen more intensely to the traces others do not see, because in that listening lies hope, the energy that drives investigation, science, and ultimately justice. That same hope that drives me to continue despite fatigue, despite fear, because I know that in the world of forensic medicine, every trace is a story, and every story deserves to be told. The night grew darker, not only because of the shadows spreading around the city, but also due to the weight I felt on my chest every time I mentally reviewed the pieces of the puzzle that relentlessly kept me awake. It wasn't simply the search for the truth about that clandestine workshop, or the death of the elderly man we had so thoroughly investigated. It was a fight against an invisible system, a multi-headed monster that fed on silence and darkness, against which my medical and scientific tools were merely limited weapons. Yet, it was the only fight I knew and the one that compelled me to continue, step by step, even amid uncertainty. I decided to return to place one last time, up to where the police had closed the perimeter and most experts had finished their inspections. I was certain there was still something we were missing, a hidden piece among the shadows of the workshop, in the firm odor of oil or in the grain of the old wood. I walked slowly, feeling the texture of the surfaces with my gaze, recalling the almost secret conversations, furtive glances, and small contradictions in the statements that had seemed irrelevant until then, but now took on new meaning at this stage of analysis. My fingers brushed against a half-open drawer, the very one that during the first inspection had not caught the attention of even the most meticulous forensic expert. Opening it carefully, I found a small forgotten notebook with somewhat wrinkled pages, on whose cover barely one word could be read: security. The paper looked old, and at first glance, its notes suggested nothing extraordinary. However, I sat down to examine every line with a magnifying glass, like someone looking for clues on an ancient map. Inside, there were apparently technical notes, but filled with code names, places, and dates that had a direct relationship with the call pattern I had found on the deceased phone. It was no coincidence. Seeing that some names matched people already identified by the police, I felt a mix of satisfaction and fear. How many other similar documents could exist? How many people were involved without even imagining it? There I understood that the network was deeper and more complex than we had initially thought, and that every contact, every whispered word, was part of a hidden script that we were only now beginning to decipher. Among the notes was a name that especially caught my attention: the Alchemist. It was a nickname never mentioned in any complaints or previous investigations, but appeared repeatedly in the notebook, linked to high-stakes operations. Searching for references, I understood it referred to someone within the local tech world, a link between industry and industrial espionage. an almost mythological figure, feared for their ability to alter systems and manipulate sensitive information with artistry-like precision. That revelation shook me because I realized we were facing the nerve center of the operation, the key piece that could dismantle the entire corrupt network. At that moment, my phone vibrated with an anonymous message that said something as brief as it was relevant. Beware the alchemist. Not everyone plays fair. The message had no signature or clues, but the unease ran deep. My instinct told me I wasn't alone in this search, and that someone else was watching my every move. I carefully put away the notebook and decided to share this new piece only with those I considered absolutely essential. Meanwhile, the atmosphere around me remained heavy, almost suffocating. The deceased family called to tell me they received new veiled threats, messages on social media, unanswered calls, even the appearance of an unmarked vehicle lurking in front of their house. A chill ran down my spine, but I could not allow fear to interfere with what was beginning to take shape as the path toward justice. I then remembered the fearful but determined look of the woman who had opened the doors to the truth, and her courage renewed my energy. One early morning, I prepared to review the phone seized during the investigation, looking for a thread that could connect all the scattered pieces. The dropped calls, the encrypted text messages, and the apparently random connections began to weave into a logical map before my eyes. But what I discovered left me increasingly astonished. Among the contacts were profiles not only linked to industrial espionage, but also to public officials, executives of tech companies, and prominent figures in local politics. Every name that appeared was a reminder that corruption and organized crime sometimes hide behind respectable labels, making the social fabric a hostile and fragile terrain. Slowly, the investigation ceased to be an isolated case and became a kind of silent war against an invisible power, one that never rested and used every means at its disposal to protect itself. I received silent phone calls, observed mysterious shadows at a distance, and felt the weight of a constant gaze upon me, as if I were part of a board where every piece moved by unknown rules. Fatigue and paranoia began to take their toll, but for some reason, I also felt more alive and more connected to the essence of my work than ever before. Then I remembered the days in the laboratory, when the cold light illuminated every tiny detail of the body, when the silent cells and tissues told me stories that could only be interpreted with patience and rigor. That was where I reconnected with the conviction that every small trace, however invisible it seemed, had the power to break the cycle of silence. That is why I could neither stop nor wanted to stop. One day at dawn, I received an unexpected visit. A man who did not clearly identify himself appeared in my office with a proposal that sounded as dangerous as it was tempting. Exclusive information, access to confidential data that could topple entire structures, but in exchange for silence about certain details. His veiled threat made me understand that the line between friend and foe was blurrier than I had thought. Ethics and justice, however, weighed more, and I rejected the offer. It was a small act, but that day I confirmed that my commitment would not yield to pressure. Amid all that turmoil, an unexpected twist shook the investigation. The woman who had collaborated with us, the same one who had decided to face danger to bring the truth to light, mysteriously disappeared. A sense of alarm overwhelmed me. She didn't answer calls or messages, and the authorities launched an intense search. That absence became an unbearable void because it represented not only the loss of a crucial voice, but also a brutal reminder of what was at stake. I worked tirelessly to find any clue, any trail that might indicate her whereabouts. Among digital files and records, I found a video secretly recorded by the woman a few days before she disappeared. In it, with nerves and sadness at once, she named compromising details about the most powerful players within the network and exposed strategies to unmask them. The recording was an urgent call, a testimony just in case. I contacted her family to ensure her voice would not be lost, and together we decided to make that confession public. The reaction was immediate and monstrous. The day the video went public, tension exploded in the streets of Montevideo. Demonstrations, protests, and accusations began to rise, while the media opened their doors to a story that could no longer be hidden. At the same time, pressure on investigators and witnesses intensified. Sabotage, direct threats, and public discrediting began. Justice showed signs of progress, but also revealed deep cracks in a vulnerable and permeable system. From the morgue, I continued parsing every report, every analysis, keeping alive the thread of scientific evidence that gave us strength. And in every examination, in every result, I felt the silent demand of the body, that voice that could not and must not be forgotten. I felt upon myself not only the responsibility of professional, but the burden of being a bridge between death and life, between silence and justice. As the months passed, we learned that the woman had managed to escape, taking refuge outside the country and maintaining contact only via secure channels. Her courage and determination had become a symbol for many, and although the corrupt network continued to operate and resist, that emerging light meant the balance was beginning to shift. I understood that justice is a long path, full of traps and shadows, but also flashes that illuminate the deepest truth. That final stage marked the before and after not only for the case, but for my own view of the profession. I understood that forensic medicine is not a mere technical or mechanical trade, but a profoundly human act, where evidence becomes voice and the body a living memory, where the silence imposed by the powerful can be broken by the tireless language of a detail, a stain, a barely visible incision. There lies the hope and the strength to continue, beyond fear, negligence, or corruption. Today I know that this investigation did not end with an official closure or a happy headline. Violence, manipulation, and injustice remain lurking in the shadows. But I also know that, at least once, a trace no one noticed changed the fate of many. That the attentive listening to a small sign can be the catalyst to dismantle the hidden system that seeks to silence the truth. And that, as long as there is someone willing to look, to question, to patiently wait for what the body has to tell, justice, although imperfect, will always have a way forward. I leave here, then, this open story as a reminder for those who believe darkness will always win. Sometimes, just sometimes, the truth reveals itself in the smallest, the imperceptible, in that trace no one wanted to see. And it is precisely in that forgotten corner where the deepest hope may reside. Because, in the end, every silent body is a story that deserves to be heard, and every just story is an act of silent resistance that, without a doubt, can change the world. The days following the release of the video of the missing woman brought with them a heavy atmosphere, filled with uncertainty and tension palpable on every corner of Montevideo. It was not just a matter of investigation or justice. It had turned into a conflict of invisible forces vying for control over a dangerous truth. I decided I had to move carefully, not only protect my integrity, but also to keep alive the hope she had ignited with that brave and definitive statement. I received fragmented news, rumors coming through unreliable informants, some credible, others clearly manipulated. But amid the noise, I managed to clarify an unexpected lead. Someone within the police structure, someone who seemed desperate to distance themselves from the tangle of darkness, had secretly contacted me. They did not use names or approaches, just a brief message recorded in an audio file that arrived on my phone in the middle of the night. The voice was hoarse, laden with fatigue and urgency, and it mentioned a place that had gone unnoticed for weeks, a small warehouse on the outskirts of the city where, supposedly, materials related to the network we were working to unravel were hidden. That revelation opened a door that seemed to have been sealed with an invisible lock. With no possibility of fully trusting anyone, and aware of the growing risk, I decided to coordinate a discreet visit with a couple of highly trusted colleagues. It was not just a professional matter, but one of survival, because we knew that any wrong move could collapse the delicate edifice of evidence being built, and with it, the chances of justice. We organized a nighttime outing, without official equipment or visible protocol, guided only by intuition and the scant information received. Getting to that warehouse was a silent journey, marked only by the intimate noise of the city that was falling asleep and waking up simultaneously in its nooks and crannies. When we finally touched the rusty metal door, the smell of dampness and dust greeted us like an unrelenting cloak. Inside, the darkness was total, barely interrupted by the beams of our flashlights, sweeping the space for signs. It was then that, amid piled boxes and scattered papers, I found a gray envelope bearing the name of the deceased who had led us to that point. An insignificant detail at first glance, but one that resonated strongly in my chest. Upon opening it, I found no weapons, no drugs, no the arms we had imagined could sustain the network. Inside were photographs, records of clandestine meetings, documents linking politicians and businessmen with dubious contracts, even encrypted correspondence with dates and codes that matched the notes in the notebook found in the workshop. The evidence was overwhelming, yet the complexity made me fear that, despite everything, impunity was still lurking, disguised within power hierarchies that protected their own tooth and nail. But just as we began to grasp the magnitude of what we had in hand, the silence was broken by a metallic noise behind us. Instinctively, we hid in the shadows, holding our breath. Soon, a figure appeared, someone seemingly familiar, perhaps linked to the alchemist, that enigmatic presence we had heard of but never seen. We don't know if they were there to guard secrets or to check for infiltrators. What was clear to us was that this moment changed everything because it demonstrated that we were being watched and that every step we took was part of a much more dangerous game. That night we returned certain that we were treading on a minefield and that any of our moves could have unpredictable consequences. I felt, perhaps the first time in a long while, the mixture of fear and adrenaline found only on the edge of genuine risk. We could not give up that was true, but all signs indicated that the adversary not only had resources, but also a network of spies, collaborators, and threats that made justice a hostile ground where the truth could be crushed before it surfaced. I then decided to change strategy. I could no longer act alone or just with my closest colleagues. It was necessary to join forces with those who, despite everything, still maintain an unwavering commitment to transparency and ethics. I contacted investigative journalists who showed commendable rigor and courage. With them, I shared the evidence we had accumulated, safeguarding their security and mine. Together, we launched a series of reports aiming to provide context without exposing too much, protecting those who still stood firm amid that minefield. The public response was significant. For months, social media became a space for debate, a stage where people began questioning the official version, where genuine pressure started to crack the comfortable impunity of some. However, in parallel, attacks intensified, discrediting campaigns, digital infiltrations, and even veiled threats to the media and sources collaborating with us. Every day increasingly resembled an invisible battlefield, one where morale was tested and psychological, where became a silent, constant adversary. Amid that whirlwind, I received a handwritten letter, with no sender, bearing a message that seemed lifted from a noir novel. The search is not for the weak. Watch carefully who surrounds you. Not everyone is an ally, and what you see is not always what it is. That dark and direct missive set off alarms within me, not only because of the warning, but because it confirmed that someone within our supposed network of trust was playing a double game. It was a disguised betrayal, a dagger in the back that could derail the progress so many brave people had driven. Thus, I began reviewing every detail about those working with me in the investigation, searching for hidden signs, inconsistencies that until then had gone unnoticed. With this new focus in mind, I recalled that in the days preceding the woman's disappearance, there were extra meetings, unexpected visits, and an oversaturation of encrypted messages pretending normality. Only then did I understand that we might have been manipulated from within, that perhaps the network we sought to dismantle had far-reaching tentacles capable of infiltrating even the most unexpected places. My paranoia grew, yes, but so did my determination. I knew I had to act with intelligence, with patience. At a crucial moment, I decided to take one last look at the body of the man from the workshop, that corpse that from the start had been the latent epicenter of the case. I reviewed every injury, every tissue with renewed precision, and there, almost imperceptible, I found something that the initial autopsies had failed to detect. A microlesion, tiny, resembling an intentionally made surgical incision, different from any pattern of direct violence. That minute and unnoticed sign for most revealed something fundamental. Someone had wanted to erase a clue, a biological trace that could carry enough weight to involve another key player, perhaps the very alchemist. It was a beacon of light amid the shadows, because I understood that while they tried to destroy visible evidence, they had underestimated the power of small invisible traces. There lay the resistance, in that detail that only patient observation and extreme commitment could uncover. Immediately, I initiated a specialized analysis on that small tissue segment, searching for DNA, chemical traces, and any indication that could connect the body directly to elements or persons within the network. The following days were a mix of hope and anxiety. The laboratory became my sanctuary, where every microscope, every piece of equipment, turned into a silent ally speaking for those who could no longer speak. While I analyzed, I remembered all those lives trapped in the network. The woman who ran away, the dead man, their families, and an entire society that deserved something that seemed so simple yet so elusive. Real, tangible justice, without disguises or lies. Finally, the report arrived. It confirmed what we suspected. The man had been inoculated with an almost undetectable toxic substance, a poison whose chemical composition matched compounds used exclusively in ultra-secret laboratories linked to the company where the alchemist supposedly had direct influence. That proof not only pointed to a possible premeditated homicide, but also opened the door to identify a third person involved, someone with privileged access to substances and processes whose goal was to silence and protect powerful interests. I felt the weight of this finding all at once, the emotion of unveiling a truth and the fear of the consequences. I knew that this invisible, almost underestimated trace had the power to dismantle an apparently invincible system. I understood that in every body resides a universe of stories, and sometimes, as in this case, those stories are revealed through a microscopic whisper no one dared to hear. Now, as I write these lines and recount this experience, I am still moved thinking about the many silent voices waiting for attentive ears. I know there will be no definitive closure, that shadows will always try to cover the truth with their mantle, but I also know that as long as there is someone willing to look into that forgotten corner, that tiny piece, justice will have one more chance. Because, in the end, the truth is not always in the obvious, many times. It hides in the small, in what seemed irrelevant. And that trace, that little trace that no one noticed, was what changed everything, what opened the door to truly understand the magnitude of the network and keep alive the hope that, for now, light could filter through the thickest darkness. The analysis was neither an easy nor a quick task. Each sample, every fiber of the fabric, had to be processed with the utmost rigor, following protocols that barely tolerated any margin of error. The toxic substance detected was not a common poison. It was perfectly designed to go unnoticed, to act silently. While awaiting the results, I immersed myself in the documentation we had found in the warehouse. The papers, photographs, codes led us through a complex web intertwining economic, political, and criminal interests to a level of sophistication that began to border on the unthinkable. Increasingly, I felt we were facing an invisible network, woven with invisible threads, endless resources, and a tremendous fear that the truth would be uncovered. However, just as the investigation seemed to be making progress, a new clue forced me to re-examine what we thought we knew. While reviewing the encrypted messages, one in particular caught my attention. A string of characters that didn't seem too complicated, but whose pattern did not fit with the others. After hours of decoding, the revelation struck me hard. That message pointed not only to an alternate location to hide evidence, but also to a name that until then had gone unnoticed because of the frequency with which it appeared in the correspondence, but without connecting the dots. It was the name of someone very close to the victim, a person whose public profile made them appear impeccable and even cooperative in the early stages of the investigation. Suddenly, that figure became suspicious and, upon confronting the data, I discovered inconsistencies in their statements and movements during the days preceding the woman's disappearance. That contradiction, an open door to concealment, fueled a growing feeling of betrayal. How could someone so close to the conflict be part of the network we were so determined to dismantle? The answer was unclear, but the fact that the name appeared in the encrypted messages was, in itself, a clue I could not ignore. With this new line of investigation, I immediately summoned my most trusted colleagues. I had decided to share my findings with them, aware that the emotional burden and the level of pressure increased every day. But we also knew that only collaboration and internal transparency could allow us to move forward without succumbing to burnout. As we discussed in hushed tones, the feeling of always being one step behind the adversary became unbearable. It seemed that every intuition we had been anticipated by someone else. We then decided to redirect the investigation, taking the initiative to closely monitor the now-suspect individual. A risky move, but essential. From that night on, the days became endless, monitoring communications, analyzing networks, gathering photographic evidence and testimonies. Everything was part of a plan that had to be executed with the precision of a surgeon. Still, the pressure was a constant presence, a shadow that extended even over those we trusted most. Paranoia became part of daily life. Coming and going from the laboratory turned into a routine full of precautions, and meetings with confidential informants took place at carefully chosen and frequently changed locations. All tactics aimed to avoid the tightening noose we imagined closing around us, the same noose that just months before it seemed impossible to avoid in Montevideo. The phone rang again one early morning. The voice on the other end, different from before, was now clear and direct. There were no threats or disguised warnings, only an invitation to a physical meeting in a public place, but without witnesses. The invitation triggered all alarms. Was this person someone from inside or a genuine potential informant? We knew that any assumption could be a fatal mistake, but the need for fresh information was urgent. The meeting took place in a lonely cafe downtown, a place with no cameras or regular staff. The person was a middle-aged man, with a discreet appearance and a tired expression. What he told me was as disturbing as it was revealing. He confirmed that the network operated with several levels of secrets, and that the apparent security shown by some involved was merely a smokescreen to mislead. Even more striking was learning that the missing woman, far from having fled or been eliminated, had left encrypted clues and messages visible only to those who knew where to look, and that these signals could be the key to triggering a chain of discoveries no one had managed to activate until then. According to his explanation, the woman had sensed a betrayal long before disappearing, and for that reason had decided to send indirect warnings to certain key people, including someone close to me. That person, whom he refused to name directly, was an official who apparently worked on the same investigative line, but whose loyalty was divided, making the situation even more complicated. It was emphasized that the greatest danger was not only external elements, but also the shadow of internal betrayal, which could dismantle everything within days. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The information, though fragmented, clarified the direction, but at the same time drew us into a more tangled and dangerous web than any of us had anticipated. I felt doubly trapped between the responsibility to move forward and the fear that any of our moves could be turned against us. I knew that uncertainty was normal in the work we did, but this time the weight was heavier than ever. Not to waste time, I organized an urgent meeting with the journalists involved. I shared the latest information I had, without giving details that could compromise sources or expose the investigation. Together, we thought of new ways to disseminate information, to apply pressure without putting protagonists at risk, and above all, to involve civil society, because the truth needed collective support to be heard above the walls of complicity. Months of intense work began to bear fruit. Several high-profile figures were named in reports, provoking mixed reactions, from flat denials to attacks against those who dared to look behind the curtain. But public pressure grew, and although the system seemed to resist tooth and nail, unexpected cracks appeared. Some insiders began sending clues, documents, records reinforcing our line of investigation. Despite the fear, the courage of a few was putting the hidden network in check. During that time, I clung to the conviction that the strength of a small trace, an almost imperceptible clue, could be the start to knock down seemingly impenetrable walls. The body of the man from the workshop, with that micro-lesion that seemed insignificant, became a symbol. Evidence that in stories that try to be silenced, sometimes the hidden detail will be the one that shouts the truth. But it wasn't just that body that spoke. Every encrypted message, every secret meeting, every journalistic report was a piece of a puzzle that, although incomplete, pointed to the inevitable exposure of the network. That certainty gave us renewed strength to continue. We knew the risk was high, that the enemy would not surrender without a fight, and that the road was costly in personal and professional terms. Still, the need for justice and respect for the victims drove us relentlessly. There were moments of doubt, certainly moments when fear threatened to paralyze us. But there were also unexpected encounters, words of encouragement from unexpected places, and signs reminding us that we were not alone. Society was beginning to listen, to question, to demand, And that collective awakening was a powerful sign, a faint light growing in the midst of darkness. Thinking of the missing woman constantly accompanied me. Her initial courage and instinct to leave invisible signs were clear testimony that every story, no matter how small it seems, has the power to change everything if someone is willing to look closely, not to give up in the face of the hidden. It was her silent strength that allowed us to get this far, and that should motivate every one of our future steps. At this moment, as I continue telling this story, I cannot help but feel a mix of gratitude and challenge. The search does not end here. On the contrary, a phase demanding greater commitment and courage is just beginning. But I also know we have already shown that even in the most hostile environment, the truth can find its way if listened to patiently, if the smallest trace is paid attention to. Because at the end of the day, justice is not a distant or abstract goal, but a constant responsibility, an act of resistance born in the details that no one else dared to see. And so, with that thought, I return again and again to the laboratory, to the reports, to the secret calls, and to the dim light that enters through the window in the mornings. I know that my work as a forensic doctor is, essentially, to listen to those bodies that speak in a silent language, to discover what silence hides, and to make every small trace a cry, a testimony that cannot be ignored or forgotten. In this most revealing case, that was the only key that opened the door to understanding how a single seemingly irrelevant piece can change the fate of an entire story and keep alive, against all odds, the hope for justice that so many await, perhaps without even knowing it. Truth does not always reveal itself with a roar. Often it slips stealthily, through the smallest, the unnoticed, like a barely perceptible whisper that, if attended to, can transform everything. That night, that clandestine route, and that micro-lesion were more than clues. They were a reflection of that silent power. And today, after passing through shadows, overcoming betrayals, and facing fears, I think that small trace no one noticed will be for me, and for all who bound the truth, a reminder that justice always finds its way, even if that path is sometimes tortuous and winding. Because in hidden details lies the real story of every human being, and looking with patience, respect, and courage at those invisible fragments is, perhaps, the most sincere way to honor the memory of those who can no longer tell it for themselves. The tension kept rising, and although we had gathered compelling evidence, the next step was as delicate as it was dangerous. One mistake, and everything could collapse. One false signal, and we would be out of the game. But the anxiety wasn't just professional. It was also deeply personal. I knew that, somewhere in this dark web, the missing woman and I were connected by an invisible thread, a rope pulling my commitment to the limit. I had set out not to let her story become just another case that was never solved. We couldn't allow that network to keep weaving impunity under the rug. In the following weeks, the surveillance intensified, not only on the newly discovered suspect, but also on possible accomplices. The investigation began to reveal layers no one had imagined. At times, it seemed the maze was endless, a succession of dead ends and false doors. But just when discouragement threatened to settle in, a new lead changed the course. An anonymous call reached our team with a detail that, at first glance, seemed incidental. The name of a place, an old warehouse on the outskirts of Montevideo where, according to the source, members of the network had been meeting. It was no surprise to know those acts happened outside the main spotlight, in gray areas where the law barely looked in. But this time we had the exact address, and with that, a plan could take shape. Preparing for that incursion was no easy task. The clandestinity with which they operated meant every move was watched by keen eyes and likely cameras installed nearby. Yet, the opportunity to find unexpected evidence was too valuable to ignore. We assembled a small, highly trained team, aware that the slightest oversight could be fatal. The night we decided to act, the air felt heavy, charged, as if the very surroundings knew something big was about to happen. We moved stealthily, almost like a shadow sliding by unseen and unheard. Upon arrival, the warehouse facade showed clear signs of recent activity. Tire tracks, doors not fully closed, dim lights turning on as certain vehicles passed by. We entered with a caution dictated by experience, knowing much more than physical evidence was at stake. The credibility of everything we had been building for months. The adrenaline mixed with fear, but there was also a firm determination driving us forward. Inside was a universe in itself, a space that appeared dedicated to logistics, storing materials. But soon we began finding documents, electronic equipment, cell phones, and USB devices hidden in makeshift compartments. It wasn't just a meeting place. It was a covert operations center, a logistical brain coordinating movements, communications, and, as we would soon discover, much darker deeds. The technology we saw there was sophisticated, capable of intercepting calls, manipulating data, even erasing digital traces with terrifying precision. When we started analyzing the recovered information, we came across a database containing contacts, dates, sums of money, and cryptic mentions of meetings and operations that bordered on the unimaginable. There were also audios and videos, fragments confirming the active participation of high-ranking figures who until then had maintained untarnished facades. Each file was a puzzle piece, explicit testimony that turned our suspicions into facts. It was impossible not to feel a mix of triumph and fear. Triumph because now we had the key that could open the door to the truth. Fear because we knew that evidence made us clear targets. But even with all that in hand, paranoia wouldn't let us lower our guard. The network seemed to be lurking, learning from our moves, always one step ahead, or at least with a hand ready to close the tragedy we were beginning to unravel. That feeling intensified when, suddenly, one of my closest colleagues started showing irregular behavior. Small, unexplained absences, evasive answers, contradictions in what he declared. Doubt crept in, the suspicion that maybe internal betrayal was deeper than we had calculated. We couldn't allow the investigation to be undermined from within, but dealing with that possibility tore away another layer of trust we thought unbreakable. As the tension gripped us all, an unexpected turn came through an encrypted message detected in the confiscated database. The code, even more enigmatic than previous ones, seemed to point to a physical hideout, but it also revealed the existence of a witness who could tell the truth from inside. Finding that person became our obsession, a beacon in the darkness promising, finally, to put a name to the shadows we had only been able to study from afar. Contacting the witness was a complex and risky operation. Their identity had to be kept absolutely secret to protect their life. Meetings were arranged in public, discreet places, constantly changing to avoid detection. When they finally agreed to speak, the clarity of their account was a devastating blow. They narrated detailed episodes involving not only the suspects we had identified, but also new figures who until that moment had remained hidden in the shadows. Every word they spoke ignited the urge to push forward, not to stand idle in the face of such injustice. One of the most impactful accounts was a description of a secret meeting where strategies were discussed to manipulate public opinion and discredit investigations through control media. This information matched previous attacks and smear campaigns we had begun to notice, confirming that the network not only operated in the dark corners, but also controlled the spotlight to protect its interests. The scale of the web grew ever wider, and the notion that the truth could be bent by power became more real. However, amid that spiral, hope also appeared. Unexpected alliances started to form. People who had been silent until then began stepping forward, driven by this collective urge for justice. Testimonies, new leads, filters operated within the system that little by little undermined the foundations of secrecy. It was an uneven battle, but inherent to it was the strength of those unwilling to stay silent. One morning, when I felt most exhausted, I received an urgent call. The main suspect had vanished without a trace. The news was a hard blow. Although we expected resistance, losing sight of such a key person complicated closing the investigation enormously. This made us speed up the search, mobilize all resources, and call for international cooperation, since there were signs they might be fleeing abroad. The tension was palpable in every gesture, the conviction that we couldn't let them escape, that the effort wouldn't be in vain. But just as it seemed the network would break with the escape, an anonymous letter arrived at our lab. In it, cryptic but direct, someone revealed the whereabouts of various documents and recordings that not only proved the crimes committed, but also implicated that missing person practices far more atrocious than we had imagined. The sender's anonymity cast a new veil of mystery, but the content was too valuable to ignore. This revitalized our actions, gave us a new clear and tangible lead. Every discovery, however, brought new questions, and sometimes the feeling that the truth blurred among so many layers of deceit. But it also strengthened the idea that, in this story, patience was not just a virtue. It was the only tool that could sustain us. Every small step, every tiny detail, as the micro-injury I so often referred to, was indeed proof that nothing is lost as long as someone is willing to look beyond the obvious. Thus, after months of sleepless nights and days full of uncertainty, we began to decipher the complete map of corruption and silence. It was not a final victory, nor a definitive closure, but was a first great step, showing the world that not all is lost, and that power can be challenged from the strength of a single testimony, a piece of evidence, a small trace no one wanted to notice, and that now spoke with unstoppable force. I then remembered the missing woman, her silent bravery, and how, even from the shadow of her absence, she had managed to guide us toward the light. And at that moment, I understood something fundamental. The work of the forensic doctor and the investigator does not end when files are closed or headlines are forgotten again. It is a task that transcends time and circumstances, where every detail found in a body, on a paper, in an improbable whisper takes on the dimension of a legacy, a debt of justice to those who are no longer here to tell their truth. As I write this, I know this story will not end here. There are still more shadows to illuminate, more cracks to open, and hidden enemies to face. But there is also a firm certainty. A trace, no matter how small it seems, never stops whispering if someone has the courage to listen. And that act of attention, that silent strength, has the power to change destinies, break down walls, and someday return peace to those who were denied justice. And so, I remain here in the lab in the city of Montevideo, with that strange mix of fatigue and hope, convinced that only those who never give up are capable of turning the inaudible whisper of a body into an irresistible call for truth. That very conviction drives me to walk every day, patiently and respectfully searching for those small traces, with the deep certainty that, in the end, justice arrives, even if it comes walking long, winding paths lit by the faintest of all traces. The anonymous letter arrived in an envelope with no return address, the ink smeared, and a message that seemed handwritten with trembling hands, as if the sender knew exactly the risk they were taking. It contained addresses, schedules, and a code name whose mere mention silenced even the toughest conversations accustomed to the harshness of investigation. This new clue forced us to rethink everything from scratch. The involvement of the main suspect went beyond what we had imagined, encompassing invisible networks, connections, and pacts that we were only now beginning to glimpse clearly. We moved to a marginal neighborhood on the outskirts, a place where the lights went out early, and the presence of strangers stirred suspicion. According to the letter, an old abandoned factory housed another node within the network, a space meant to keep negotiations and decisions under control, those that influenced the highest levels of corrupt power. Going there without a solid plan was a dangerous gamble, but the weight of the evidence and the ethical commitment guiding me left no room for doubt. The entire night before the operation, I barely closed my eyes. It wasn't just physical exhaustion, but the emotional burden I had been accumulating, and the persistent memory of that woman whose disappearance had started this tormenting path. I remembered her face caught in the photographs her family had given me, the trembling voices of her loved ones demanding justice, and how every inch of the body I had analyzed told a silent story. That story was now at stake, held between worn walls and hidden documents, and I felt that pressure like an invisible hand tightening around my throat. When we finally entered the place, the atmosphere was dense and dark, filled with a strange silence that seemed to resist being broken even by our movement. The floor was covered in dust and debris, a scene easily overlooked by a quick eye, but we advanced step by step, alert to any sign. There were no gunshots or confrontations, but the absence of noise became unsettling. Only after a few minutes did we understand why. The site was no longer active minute to minute, but rather served as an archive, a physical repository for the clandestine memory of crimes. That was when we discovered something unexpected. A hidden room behind a bookshelf, barely visible and protected by a rudimentary security system that was nevertheless sophisticated enough to prevent hurried access. We had to use special tools to open the entrance, hearts racing, recalling all the scenarios that might await us on the other side. The door finally gave way, revealing a small room with walls covered in shelves packed with folders, hard drives, and boxes labeled with unintelligible codes. We began quickly sorting and reviewing all the materials, aware that time was not on our side. Among the digital files appeared videos, photographs, and audios exposing the machinery of deception and fear. Intercepted conversations, under-the-table payments, instructions to manipulate witnesses and silence uncomfortable voices. But what truly shook us was a series of documents recording financial movements intended to bribe public officials and police officers, demonstrating a sprawling network of corruption reaching levels we hadn't dared to imagine. The most shocking fact emerged shortly after, when we found an audio recording in which a voice, presumably the mastermind of the conspiracy, coldly described the fate awaiting the missing woman and others who dared to challenge the network. That terrible confession, captured in the digital ether, not only confirmed direct involvement, but also revealed the systematic method they used: fear, disappearance, calculated oblivion. Listening to those words was like hearing a pending sentence, but at the same time it gave us renewed strength not to take a single step back. As we reviewed that evidence, the feeling of being watched grew. It wasn't paranoia, I was convinced. The network had eyes everywhere, and at that moment we felt trapped in a game where being discovered could mean the end. I decided to call my superiors to request reinforcements and increase security measures, but the communication was abruptly cut off. It was a clear warning. We were treading on forbidden ground, and someone didn't want us to go any further. A heavy silence settled, a palpable fear mixed with determination. I knew we had to react cautiously, but without stopping. Then, amid that unbearable tension, I received an encrypted message on my personal phone. It was strange, because they had never used my private line before, so the message had a special meaning. Decoding it was like catching a breath in the middle of the storm. An unknown contact gave me coordinates for an urgent meeting, promising decisive information about the exact location of the missing suspect. Without hesitation, I organized the operation with a small team, deploying a protocol designed precisely for delicate operations, avoiding cameras and patrol checkpoints. The place the tip led us to was even more isolated than the previous ones, an old warehouse on the edge of a dirt road, almost lost amid the thick brush. As we approached, the feeling that something was about to happen was as intense as a silent roar. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the bushes, pale and disheveled, but with eyes that scrutinized with both desperation and determination. It was a missing witness, someone who, thanks to our actions, had survived until that moment, ready to tell us the ultimate truth. His story, told in a low voice with deep pauses, was more impactful than any document. What he revealed confirmed not only the magnitude of the network, but also that behind the scenes and numbers were broken lives, personal betrayals, and sacrifices that exceeded tolerable limits. He exposed unsuspected alliances and the existence of forces seeking to bury the truth even at the cost of enforced silence. Each word was a display of courage, but also latent fear of the reprisals looming over us. The witness spoke of the missing woman with admiration and sadness, describing her not as an ordinary victim, but as a beacon of integrity who tried to act from within to dismantle the network. Her disappearance was no accident, but a premeditated action to send a message to those who dare to follow in her footsteps. That revelation hit me hard. I understood I had been chasing something far deeper than a conventional investigation. It was a fight for dignity, for the memory of those who refused to be silenced. As I listened, I realized that the path to justice was longer and tougher, and that evidence and testimonies alone were not enough. It required courage to uphold the truth in a world where lies are sometimes easier to impose. I felt that the small trace I had found at the beginning, that seemingly insignificant micro-injury, was actually the starting point of an irreversible change, because that is where true strength begins, in paying attention to the small, the unnoticed, that resists disappearing. When the witness finished, silence returned, but with a different weight, less oppressive. It was a silence of someone who, after years, can finally speak, even if only in whispers. It was at that moment that I confirmed what I'd always known. The work of the forensic doctor, of the investigator, not only reconstructs bodies but restores lives, even if only in words, in memories, in small traces that do not die. We left that night with more questions, but also with newfound strength. We knew the enemy was still there, invisible and resentful, but we were no longer alone. Truth was beginning to break through like a luminous crack, and perhaps someday that missing woman would cease to be a shadow and become a symbol. As I write now, in the silence of my laboratory in Montevideo, I wonder what other forgotten traces await to be found. How many silent whispers wait for someone to listen with the necessary patience? Because in this profession, that small attention is what breaks walls. That is the key that can transform a mystery into justice, an absence into memory, a sign to a scream that changes destinies forever.